Okay, it's about 11 o'clock on Mother's Day, which is Sunday. Okay, the mission for today, I need to make an adapter that I can mount my sprocket to a shaft. And what I realized would work out really well, I think, is if I can mount the sprocket and the disc rotor for the brakes on the same piece. So since I don't have a lathe or anything fancy, I'm just using some square tubing and welding it to a center point. And then I'll drill holes in this, and then that will mount the sprocket and the disc rotor to the same piece and space it out about an inch apart. I actually have some transfer punches, which I just remembered. So using the transfer punch, I can use a hub that I already have that's got the wrong size of center shaft for it, and I'll mark my new piece with that, and then drill it out. Start with a pilot hole to get the holes in the right spot, then we'll drill it out to size. This little drill press is just barely good enough to do this. I like using my stepper bits for deburring. That works out really well. Okay, so now we'll check it. And the bolts look like they're going to line up, so this part is good. Inside the square tubing, I've got a piece of half-inch iron pipe that'll help locate the shaft on the right spot. And we'll put it together and put some bolts in. And this actually looks like it'll work. I'm as surprised as anybody. Of course, the bolts I have aren't quite long enough, but that'll work for now. Now the way I'm setting this up at this point, I'm running a half-inch bolt through a bearing block that I've got. Of course, that's not quite centered, but we can dial that in later. What I was hoping to be able to do is to run a shaft in between these two bolts. I got one bolt where the rear sprocket is for the pedal chain, and then the shaft will transfer the torque from the pedal chain all the way across to pick up the rear wheel. Okay, I took it apart again. I'm going to cross drill a hole that goes through the adapter and through the bolt. That'll lock it. That's instead of using something intelligent like a key. This whole project ends up being a kludge, and at the end I finally just gave up on it. There's a couple things that are just not going to work here, and one of the issues I ran into is if I drilled a hole to put a bolt to lock this bolt in place, that would take out too much of the metal and then it would be too weak. So I figured I'd just run a cotter pin through there, which honestly I don't think that would have worked anyway. It would have broken the cotter pin. But I had them, so I figured I'd try it. Yeah, the further down this road I got, the worse it looked. And I put a whole day into this, and by the end I'm like, you know what, this is just not going to work. So if you're watching this thinking this might be a good idea, parts of it I think could work, but the whole thing altogether, no, not so much. For this version though, I thought, well, let me just try using some conduit because I had a bunch of it, and I'm like, okay, I'm only pedaling on this, it's not the motor. So if I put a conduit in between and then drilled holes through the bolts and then ran cotter pins. One of the things I realized though after the fact, because of how these bearings are set up, the bearings will pivot, which is good to help with a little bit of misalignment. The problem is the bearing on each end, the shaft in between the two bolts isn't enough to lock it. So they would have just flopped around and that would have been the end of it. So by the end of the day, I realized how bad of an idea this really was, and I'm going to take it all apart again and just run one continuous shaft that goes all the way through both bearings and picks up both sets of sprockets, and then that would be fine. Yeah, the harder I tried, the more I looked at it. I'm like, this is the kind of thing that's going to leave me on the side of the road somewhere and not work. So in the end, I'm like, just put it all away and come back the next day with a better idea. So yeah, sometimes you learn something from the failures though, so it's kind of worth looking at least.